And now let's cross live to Munich to our political correspondent Catherine Forster, who has a big exclusive for us. Catherine, take it away.
Yes, good afternoon, Martin. From Munich, it feels like Munich is the sort of epicenter of geopolitics at the moment. This huge security conference going on here, the Vice President, J.D. Vance, Volodymyr Zelensky, all the talk, of course, about the future of Ukraine, given the incoming Donald Trump now seemingly calling all the shots. And I caught up just in the last hour with the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Now, of course, he led the way, didn't he? He was Prime Minister when Russia invaded Ukraine almost 3 years ago. He led the way in support for Ukraine. Ukraine now incredibly concerned about what's going on. Let's see what Boris Johnson makes of it all. Boris Johnson, we're here in Munich at what feels like a pivotal moment for Europe. The current Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, isn't here. But why are you?
Well, I think it's a very good conference to be at, particularly now, because the Americans, the Trump administration, is clearly getting closer to deciding how they're going to solve this appalling conflict. And you've heard their plans. I think there's quite a lot of headless chickenism, quite frankly, from the Europeans about what the Trump administration is saying. And I think it's very important to get what that administration or what the US is saying in perspective, because they aren't, I don't think, looking at what Trump is saying, looking at what Pete Hegseth is saying. They're not betraying Ukraine. They're not walking away from Ukraine. They're saying Ukraine's got to be a sovereign, prosperous country. They're saying that Putin can't win. They're saying that they'll continue to support Ukraine. What they are saying is that they want the Europeans to step up and do more. And there, I think you've got to say that Trump has a very, very good point. Look at the graphs produced, for instance, by the Kiel Institute. Look at the sheer quantity of American weaponry, kit that's gone to Ukraine. $65 billion worth at least. Compare it to what has come from the whole of the rest of NATO, the whole of Europe, and it dwarfs it, right? And so what Trump is trying to say to the Europeans, to us Brits, to everyone, is man up and step up, or person up. You Europeans have got to do more, and you've got to face it. The American people elected him on a mandate to get value. They don't want to walk. I don't think the Americans want to walk away from Ukraine, but they do want the Europeans to do more. And I think we in the UK have got a lead on that.
Some people worry that Trump is effectively acting as an appeaser, and that this could be a repeat of 1938.
I think, as I say, I think that's a misunderstanding of what Donald Trump is trying to do. Donald Trump knows very well that he personally cannot afford to have a chaotic collapse in Ukraine. His new administration is trying to get on with all sorts of things. They can't afford to see the Zelensky government overwhelmed, Putin take over, a complete humiliation for NATO, a humiliation for the West. That is no way for the new Trump administration to begin. He does not want that to be his political legacy. What he wants is for us, for the Brits, for the rest of the Europeans, as I say, to step up and shoulder more of the burden. That was the pledge he made to the American people during the election campaign. And he feels he's got to deliver on that.
Are you personally speaking to Donald Trump about Ukraine?
Obviously, I keep in contact with a lot of people about Ukraine, and I keep in touch with the president on this. But I'm really speaking from just looking at the words he has used in the Oval Office, what Pete Hegseth has said here, what Marco Rubio has said. Just looking at what the Trump administration has said, it's very, very important to kind of look at what they're actually saying, the meaning of what they say, rather than some of the fears of the anti-Trump critics. And I don't see how practically, politically, they can afford to betray Ukraine.
So you don't believe that we're going to end up in a situation that Ukraine can never join NATO, that it has to give up all of the territory that it's currently got? Because from the conversation with... that all the territory that Russia currently occupies, that...
Well, you heard what Donald Trump said in the Oval Office. He said that there couldn't be a peace deal unless Putin gave back territory that he's taken. He also said, and Pete Hegseth said this too, that Ukraine, their vision for the future of Ukraine, is a sovereign, prosperous country, an independent country. Now, you can't be a sovereign country if you are constrained, if you're prevented at some stage in the future from deciding whether you're going to join NATO, which club you're going to belong to. That, if you're a sovereign country, which is what Pete Hegseth says he wants Ukraine to be, then you've got to have that freedom. If you don't have the freedom to join NATO, then you're not a sovereign country, you're a slave state, right? So you know, I just think people need to focus more carefully on what the Trump administration is actually saying. And what we need to do as Europeans, what the Brits need to do, and frankly, you mentioned Keir Starmer, you mentioned what we should be doing now is working with our European friends on that crucial part of the Trump proposals, which is to fortify Ukraine. If we can't get them immediately into NATO, what we need to do now is strengthen them with NATO-grade weaponry, intelligence, logistics, drones, tanks, guns, shells, everything that they could conceivably need, so that they're basically in future totally indigestible to Putin. A steel-quilled porcupine that he can never take another bite out of. And the UK could lead that. We're the second biggest player in NATO. We're a serious military power. That is what we should be doing.
Boris Johnson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So there you heard Boris Johnson with his typical way with words, saying that Ukraine needs to be made into a totally indigestible porcupine so that never can any more bites be taken out of it. Also saying that he feels some European leaders are running around like headless chickens. He seems to take a very much more positive and optimistic view over Donald Trump's plans for Ukraine and Europe than many here at the Munich Security Conference. A very, very different tone indeed.
Catherine Forster, I've got to say, fantastic scoop grabbing Boris Johnson there in Munich. Well done to you. Certainly setting the agenda from Munich. Catherine Forster, excellent work. Thank you very, very much for getting that to us here on GB News. Now, back to Paddington now. You're listening in there intently. Chris Hope, political editor, GB News. Typical floral language, but I thought it was very interesting how Boris appears to be positioning himself here as something of a bridge betwixt Trump and the Conservative Party and NATO. Bit of a kind of mini Farage.
Even a Trump whisperer, dare we say it. We saw a bit of this, didn't we, when, of course, Trump was sworn as president. Who was in the rotunda? Not Nigel Farage, he was somewhere else, but Boris Johnson was in there. And that is fascinating. I think that, you know, Johnson has got a role here. He can see himself supporting Ukraine, trying to explain what Trump means when he says these things, which cause so much pearl clutching amongst the European elite, I think. He thought their NATO-grade weaponry should go to Ukraine, making it into a steel porcupine. Russia can't take a bite out of it anymore. Step up, shoulder more, man up, person up, he even said, to talk the language of some of the woke mates in Munich. I think that's interesting, and it shows, I think, that Boris Johnson hasn't gone away. Part of Ukraine for him is a personal legacy. He drove the pace on defending Ukraine when the EU was slower to act. He went further than they did. I think he sees lots of personal political capital tied up in it. Interesting how he says Trump does not want to humiliate Europe. He wants them to pull their weight. A conversation which I'm sure will roll and roll and roll. We'll have more reaction to that interview throughout the rest of the show. Let's return now to some domestic politics, though, Chris. Now, under fire, Chancellor Rachel Reeves about her CV, massage
divulging perhaps the truth, not knowing the difference between 5.5 years and a decade, allegations of expenses, handbags, perfume. She's responded for the first time.
That's right. Well summarised there. Rachel Reeves, of course, we used to work for Halifax Bank of Scotland, Bank of England, before she became an MP. She's had to rewrite some of her earlier employment history this week for the second time in 3 months on her LinkedIn online CV. She worked for 5.5 years at the Bank of England, not 10 years, as she has said in some speeches. Of course, last November, she also tweaked that record. And separate to that, this was after a BBC investigation, I should say, 3-month investigation. Separate to that, the BBC said she'd been investigated over bank expenses claims that she had put forward. Now, very briefly, they had a credit card there at Halifax Bank of Scotland, a motivation card. I'm sure we don't need them at GBNews. We are already motivated here to work. You got it. But they allowed you to buy handbags and perfume, earrings, wine for people who are doing well at the company. And it was being looked at, the BBC say, and investigated. This is completely denied by Rachel Reeves overnight. And for the first time ever, she's responded to what has been claimed about her. And here's what she had to say moments ago.
Well, no one ever raised any concerns about my expenses when I worked for Halifax Bank of Scotland. I submitted, had processed and had my expenses signed off in the proper way, as you would expect, and no issues were ever raised during my time at Halifax Bank of Scotland.
It seems strange that...
So a full denial there, Chris, as you perhaps expect.
Yeah, we did expect that. I think, it is being talked about. A lot of people are wondering what is there, what's left. And she says she has no recollection of the individual claims that were made. So it may well be that you were able to buy gifts for good-performing colleagues. Her spokesman said, of course, that she's not aware of any investigation, nor was she interviewed for it. All the expenses were submitted and signed off in the proper way. It just leaves a kind of feeling over her. She's not really creating her employment history very directly. She blamed a member of her team for not updating LinkedIn properly. But as a human being, if you work at the Bank of England, the biggest job you can have outside of politics in her world, not to know or be clear on when you started, when you finished that job, is a bit casual about what happened.
I look forward to you buying me some perfume or a handbag one day for a job well done. But it is Valentine's Day. I digress. You've got another great scoop. Chopper's Political Podcast, the talk of the town, Reform and Conservatives perhaps merging.
It's all anyone talks about away from the studio, in the pubs and bars of Westminster. Everyone's talking about how can Reform come together with the Tory party and then have a proper lead over the Tory party going into the next election. I interviewed Sir Edward Lee. He is the most senior MP in Parliament. He's the father of the House. He's the most senior, therefore, Tory MP. He said this about bringing those two parties together.
What are the odds on Reform and the Tories merging to be one party at the next election?
Oh, I think very high. I mean...
odds on?
70%.
There, 70% chance of coming together. He thinks a third of the parliamentary party and the Tories are in favour of a deal between Reform and the Tories. He says in terms in this podcast, Chopper's Political Podcast, to remind viewers, that the policies of the two parties are absolutely identical. There's no point in spending 3 or 4 years scrapping and then standing against each other and then let Keir Starmer get in with 30% of the vote. Now,
but there's trouble afoot because a certain Ms Badenoch is a fly in the ointment.
Well, I'm coming on to that because I asked him also, will your leader, Kevin Badenoch, be your leader at the next election? He said, I have no idea. I wish her well. Well, that leader, Kevin Badenoch, has replied this afternoon to reporters. Here's what you had to say.
I'm afraid I do disagree with Sir Edward. Everyone is entitled to their opinion, but the Conservative Party is under new leadership. It is important that people know what we stand for. And the public are tired of backroom deals and not getting what it is that they vote for. What I need to make sure is that people can see that we are the party demonstrating true and authentic Conservative principles.
We have Kevin Badenoch, the leader for about 4 months, disagreeing with the most senior MP in our party and in Parliament. Martin.
Chris, what an action-packed start to the show. Fantastic stuff. Look forward to you again in the next hour. By the way, happy Valentine's Day.